It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Bob Fahey. He's an associate professor of forestry at UConn. Prior to that, a research scientist at Morton Arboretum. I knew Bob when he was a PhD student at University of Wisconsin, and he was fortunate enough to take sympathy on me, hire me as a field and lab technician in his lab and at the Morton Arboretum. So I told anybody else who would listen that if it wasn't for Bob, I probably wouldn't be here. So good man, and pass it over to him.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so thanks for having me out. I'm excited to be in Michigan. I spend a lot of time in Michigan, so this is not out of the ordinary for me. My mom's actually from Grand Rapids, so I like Michigan. As you see, a lot of my research is actually in Michigan, and I'll talk about that a lot. So I'm in a natural resources department at UConn, and I'm kind of a forest ecologist, but both of my graduate degrees are from forestry programs and silviculture. So I try to straddle this line of silviculture and forest ecology. And so my lab at UConn we've come up with the applied forest ecology, right? So that's trying to meld silviculture management with forest ecology. And I do a lot of research on just trying to understand how to adapt our forests to global change and other stressors, and how to manage our forests to be resilient to a variety of different potential stressors. And I have lots of different things that I do research on. Today, I'm going to talk about this first one, thinking about forest structure and complexity. I also study tree species losses and how that affects ecosystem functioning. I do a lot of work with silviculture still, adaptive silviculture especially. And I also do a lot of research on coupled forest infrastructure resilience, working with utilities. I'm not going to talk about any of that today. I'm going to focus on this. But if you want to talk to me about trees falling on power lines and that kind of stuff, I'm happy to get into that later. So when we talk about complexity, I'm going to have 4 different research topics that I'm going to go through. First, I'm going to talk about how we define complexity in forests and how we understand what things drive variation in complexity among forests. Get the underlying thing going there. So if we're thinking about how to define complexity in forest ecosystems, there's a lot of different ways that people use the term complexity when they talk about forests. Silviculture, we're often focused on complexity, managing for complexity, but oftentimes that's more thinking about the overall system, even including the human aspects of the system, not the physical structure of the ecosystem. And, for example, my master's advisor, Klaus Puttmann, when he wasn't fishing, was writing books about how we might manage for complexity within silvicultural systems. And we published a paper several years ago about how the ideas around complexity in silviculture have changed over time. Probably needs an update now. This was from 7 or 8 years ago. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is mostly focused more from an ecological perspective on structural complexity or structural diversity in forests and how we can understand that complexity and manage for it. We had a special issue in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment focused on this idea of structural diversity in forests that I helped to organize. And I'll talk about this at length, but structural complexity is an indicator of lots of different aspects of forests that we might try to manage for biodiversity, old growth condition, all these sorts of things. But even when we talk about defining physical structural complexity or structural diversity in forests, it's not clear always what we're talking about. There's different things that we could focus on. There's a long history in forestry and silviculture and forest ecology of quantifying stem size distributions and spatial patterns in where the trees are within a forest, or how much dead wood there is in the forest as an indicator of the complexity of the system, as an indicator of oftentimes old growth conditions. But there's also been a focus over the long term on how complex the canopy is. And when I was a undergraduate research technician, we used this thing called a height pole, where you have this extendable pole that you push up into the canopy and you record every time it hits a leaf. This is how we measured the vertical complexity of the canopy 25, 30 years ago. It's becoming a lot easier to quantify now in the last couple of decades, and I'll talk about that at length. What's not easier to quantify is the below ground complexity in forests, and this is something that's an area of active research that I'm not going to talk about much today, but really interesting. You can't shoot lasers below ground, right? There are people working with ground penetrating radar to try and quantify the complexity of root systems. My collaborator, Liz LaRue, who's at UTEP, is doing this. Doesn't work in Connecticut because Connecticut is just a big pile of rocks. But it does work in the systems she works at in the desert Southwest, right, where it's just sand. So I'm not going to talk about that really, but something that's kind of interesting. I'm going to talk about the canopy. And the canopy is obviously important in forests, right? It's a driver of ecosystem functioning in a lot of ways. What we do a lot in my lab is focus on characterizing the overall 3D structure of the above ground component of the forest, right? So all of the stems, the canopy, everything that is above the ground, and then use that information to understand functioning, resilience, all these sorts of things. And we use terrestrial LiDAR mostly. We will also occasionally use aerial LiDAR, drone LiDAR, other systems, even like image analysis. But generally terrestrial LiDAR, because the shooting a laser at the forest from below, you get a lot more information about the interior structure of the canopy. When you shoot it from above, the top of the canopy is very dense, and you don't get a lot of information on that internal structure, which is really important for functioning. The other reason is that I'm a forest ecologist and I like to walk around the woods. I don't want to just fly a drone over the woods. So selfishly, I like to walk around the woods, and I have a backpack now, and I'd much rather just walk around the woods with a backpack on and get information than like figure out how to fly a drone. But I do work with drone people. So the whole point here is that we know that the quantity of surface area of leaves and other vegetation in a forest is important, but it's also important how it's arrayed within the volume of the canopy. So how much of the volumetric capacity is filled, how much layering there is, how many spaces there are within the canopy volume, all this kind of thing can be really important for us functioning. And we've often talked about this as structural complexity, but this recent issue that Liz LaRue kind of led tried to push it towards structural diversity, and we're still fighting over which term we're going to use, but I think they won. We'll see. What I do is, one way we think about this is trying to come up with metrics to characterize those aspects of the forest canopy, so like layering and volume and all that kind of stuff, and use these as traits of a canopy that we might be able to link to things like productivity or light capture or microclimatic conditions. So we developed an R package. My collaborator, Jeff Atkins, was the leader behind this, that takes LiDAR data and turns it into these metrics of different aspects of the canopy structure. And some of these are familiar, right? So we pull out vegetation area index, which, when you're shooting lasers at the tree, you don't necessarily know whether it's a leaf or a branch. So we call it vegetation area index, but the density of the canopy, how much leaf area there is one category of thing you might want to know about the structure of the canopy. But we're also interested in things like the height of the canopy and the variability in the layering of the canopy throughout the canopy volume, where that canopy is arrayed, So like where the like 90% of the canopy is, the arrangement of that canopy within the canopy volume. So there's clumping indices, there's things like porosity, which is these little spaces within the filled volume of the canopy where light can scatter around. Openness, another one that's pretty obvious and pretty well known about in forest ecology, just places where light can get all the way through the canopy. And then complexity metrics that take this information and come up with sort of ways to describe the 3D arrangement of the canopy. And some of these, like the surface rugosity, is how rumpled this outer surface of the canopy is. We have a metric that we call canopy rugosity, which is a descriptor of the 3D complexity of the arrangement of canopy elements within the whole canopy volume. And so I'll mention this metric rugosity a lot. It's an important one, and one that describes well this vegetation complexity within the canopy volume and how complex the arrangement of it is. But as you can imagine, all of these metrics, all of these traits are really strongly correlated with each other. So we've thought about how do you take these metrics and link them to functioning without sort of overfitting models and that kind of thing. So from a data perspective, we think one good way to do this is to use all these metrics together to try and define canopy structural types. So if you have 30 different traits that describe different physical properties of the canopy, you can then mash those together and try to come up with types of canopies, and then try and link that to functional outcomes, to management strategies, to disturbance histories and that kind of thing. So you might have tall, dense, multi-layered forests that have high VAI, high vertical complexity, high structural complexity indices. And then you could have more open canopied forests, and you could have the same amount of vegetation area index, but arrayed in a very simple way within the canopy volume. And so we've expected, going into some of this research, that we'd be able to distinguish different canopy structural types based on all of these metrics that we get from LiDAR, and then use that information in trying to understand the functioning of the forest. And the idea here is partly to try to understand what drives variation in the structure of the forest canopy and the complexity of the canopy. And I sometimes talk about it this way, that we think that the expressed canopy structure that you find anywhere in a forest is probably a function of the species and their traits. So like the functional traits of the species, the expressed traits of those species, so like adaptation to environment, that sort of thing, expressed traits in the crown, and then history, which is things like disturbance history and land use history, that kind of thing. So it's driven by environment, by species inherent functional traits, and by the history of the site, the history of the forest. So in order to try and get into some of this stuff, we had a project several years ago that was funded by the Macro Systems Program, RIP, at NSF, that focused mostly on neon sites across the eastern part of the US. So it's a subcontinental network across 6 of NEON, National Ecological Observatory Network, for those who don't know the acronyms, 6 ecoclimatic domains here. So basically the eastern part of the US. And we went to all these sites and sampled them with a terrestrial LiDAR. This was a while ago, so we're using this homemade LiDAR system. We kind of were on the early edge of using LiDAR in this way, and so it was pretty novel back then. Now everybody has LiDAR, right? Which is awesome, but we were still using this homemade system back then. To try and the goal of this was to try and understand if if we go across all these forests at a subcontinental scale, are we going to see the forest resolve into these distinct canopy structural types across this subcontinental data set? We had our first project meeting. This is a collaboration with Chris Goff from Virginia Commonwealth University, Brady Hardiman from Purdue, and Jeff Atkins, who's back now at VCU. He was at the Forest Service for a long time. When we had our first project meeting, we stayed at a hotel in Richmond, Virginia, and right across from the hotel was one of these laser tag places called Laser Quest. And so we're like, it's a sign. So this project was then dubbed Laser Quest forever. It was a lot of fun. But basically, and I show this picture of me wearing the LiDAR, but really Jeff, who was the postdoc on the project, just drove around the entire eastern US with this and strapped this LiDAR onto himself and walked around. And I think he had a lot of fun doing it. And what we found was, generally, there was a pretty strong separation of forests into different distinct canopy structural types based on, at the time, 26 metrics of traits of the canopy. This is a picture of a multi-dimensional, non-metric multi-dimensional scaling ordination. You don't need to worry about it too much. It's basically, this is vertical variability here on a bunch of those traits that illustrate vertical variability. And then this is canopy density here. And so it's pretty much the same as this, depiction, this like hypothesis that we had, except that I should have flipped it over, right? So this is the more the more vertically structured forest here, and it's down here on this graph. I should have just flipped it over, but whatever. So this variation here is from very tall, structurally complex forests to very uniform forests, but all with very dense canopies, relatively dense canopies. And then these are less dense canopies out here with either low vertical variability or high vertical variability. And you can see there are some gaps in that sort of spectrum. There's not any tall, vertically complex forests that are really, really open. It's hard to have that in reality. Maybe if we sampled across the entire world, we would fill in these holes. I'm not sure. That's something that would be interesting to do at some point. When we overlay the ecoclimatic domains, you can see that there's a lot of separation, that certain forest types and certain ecoclimatic domains are kind of in different parts of this spectrum, right? So we have longleaf pine forests in Florida that are the open canopied, not very complex canopy. And we have, this is the Appalachian, this is Great Smoky Mountains down here with these very vertically complex, very dense forests. And you'll notice that we had a bunch of different data sets. This is just the neon data. You'll notice there's a hole here where there's not the most dense, the most complex forests. Those are actually old growth forests in Michigan from up near the University of Michigan Biological Station were the ones that were out here. So those true neon didn't have real old growth forests in it. The real old growth forests came out here at that far end, at least in northern hardwood forests, hemlock northern hardwood forests. So there's a strong influence of ecoclimatic domain, forest type on structure, but there's also an influence of things like successional history, disturbance history, and that kind of thing. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the second one here, so functioning. So the real reason, it's really interesting to try and understand what drives complexity, but the real reason we're interested is because it's affecting the functioning of the forest. And, so going back to, a lot of foundational research by people like Peter Reich, we know that the surface area of leaf, the leaf area index in a forest drives productivity, right? So Peter Reich had this graph in one of his papers that basically leaf area index is explaining up to 70% of the variation among forests and productivity. And there's lots of other studies out there that have similar kind of findings. But what about that other, 30-ish%? What's driving the rest of that variation? And there's lots of things that it could be, but we were interested in knowing, well, is some of that variation related to how that leaf area is arrayed within the forest canopy? Can we figure out whether, you have the similar amount of leaf area index, but you have much higher complexity in this kind of forest than in this kind of forest? Does that complexity at the same level of leaf area matter in how productive a forest is? So again, we use the same data set of the same subcontinental data set, but in this case, we're also at the same time that Jeff was running around with the LiDAR, he was using a septometer to figure out how much light was being transmitted through the canopy. And then we're using neon data on above ground NPP to assess the productivity of the forest. And one thing we found is that the complexity of the canopy, that rugosity, or what other complexity metric we might use, explained a huge amount of the variation in light interception. So how much the light that came to the top of the canopy was being captured by the canopy, both within and among sites across this large network. And the productivity of the forest was very strongly predicted by complexity. So this is that canopy rugosity metric that explains the physical arrangement, complexity in the physical arrangement of the canopy. We see relating that to net primary productivity here, we see an R squared of 0.8, right? So really across this big network that a subcontinental scale, this structural complexity of the canopy explains productivity really strongly, much more strongly than the amount of leaf area in this case. And height is also important. And part of this is that taller canopies or taller forests are more productive, right? That's something you learn about, right, in forestry right from the start. If you have a taller canopy, it's going to be more, a taller forest, it's likely to be more productive. We would argue it's more productive because it has more space in the canopy to fill that canopy with a complex arrangement of vegetation. So we see this really strong correlation between complexity and height. Both of them drive productivity, but I think it's actually the complexity of the canopy that is the driver there. So in all of these studies, what we found is that complexity is strongly related to forest productivity, canopy complexity. And part of that is that it's more effective at harvesting light, but it's also more effective at using that light to drive productivity. So light use efficiency goes up, is higher in a more complex canopy. And so that per unit efficiency of using light to drive NPP is higher in complex canopies. And it has to do with leaf level changes in morphology, physiology, biochemistry that we've studied in a bunch of subsequent papers that looked at how did trees change their leaf traits in response to having a more complex canopy. So you get more light scattering within the canopy volume. The trees respond to that by altering their leaf structure and physiology to take advantage of that. It's also really important for things like water cycling, microclimate, biodiversity. There's lots of studies out there. There's a lot of people in Europe studying microclimate and complexity. So there's a lot of functions that are driven by this complexity of the canopy volume. But you may be thinking to yourself, or maybe you're not, you're buying everything I'm saying, but you may be thinking to yourself, okay, well, you went and studied complexity at the subcontinental scale, and it's related to productivity, but didn't you just say previously that it's got to do with history, and there's all these other factors that drive variation in complexity. How do you know that complexity is actually driving productivity? And we don't, right? We don't know that there's not other things going on that are underlying that relationship in these observational studies. So what we're trying to do now is isolate that specific effect of structural complexity on forest productivity. So we designed this experiment at the Yukon forest where I work, where we're actually manipulating the forest to either increase or decrease, maintain the complexity of the canopy. So we scan the forest with our terrestrial LiDAR, segment out all the trees into an individual tree canopy model, and then designed treatments in the computer that would, based on the computer model, would either increase or decrease the complexity of the canopy. Then we went out and actually did it in the field to see, to study this relationship between complexity and productivity. And that, like, 2 sentences there was 6 years of my PhD student Brandon Albashir's life. But it's a I'll talk a little bit more about his work in a minute, but he had a lot of fun. Got a little grumpy by the end. Because this is the thing where, like, we were designing these techniques, like we weren't using some pre-existing strategies for this, so it was hard. But we implemented these treatments in the field a couple of years ago, and we do seem to have been successful at increasing the complexity of the canopy in our increase treatments. And this one I call maintain now, because it turns out when you go in and create a disturbance, it's really hard to decrease the complexity of the canopy initially. But I think we got to where this has been disturbed and it's similar to control, but it's very different from the complexity treatment. And so our goal here is to then study over the next, it's going to take a decade, but to do long-term monitoring of leaf to ecosystem scale functioning, to see how that difference here in complexity will play out in replicated controlled experiment to in terms of NPP and the mechanisms underlying that NPP response. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is disturbance and how disturbance might influence complexity, but also how the relationship between complexity and functioning is related to disturbance. So how resistance and resilience to disturbance can be related to complexity outcomes following disturbance. So one thing we're interested in is how does canopy structure respond to different kinds of disturbance? And can we use the signature of the change you see in canopy structure as an indicator of disturbance and a way to characterize disturbances? And then how the complexity outcomes of disturbance might affect disturbance response in forests. So Jeff Atkins had a paper where we looked at a bunch of observational studies of disturbance to see if there was different signatures of disturbance on canopy structural complexity metrics. And he created these cool, like, I don't know what they're called, spider plots or something that are kind of incomprehensible. But basically what it's showing is that there were some differences in these different types of disturbance in their complexity outcome and their canopy structural outcomes. But this is observational work, and so it's really hard to separate out the effect of the disturbance from all those other factors that I'm talking about: species composition, the environment, that sort of thing. So we've spent a lot of time focusing on experimental disturbance studies at the scale of whole canopies, whole ecosystems, and trying to understand the effect of those disturbance experiments on canopy structure and functioning. So I have two primary research sites where I do this work. One is Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest up in New Hampshire, which I'm guessing a lot of you have heard of, mostly from a hydrology perspective, but we also do a lot of other work up there. And the other one is the University of Michigan's biological station. I thought there might be like an alarm or something when I put up the maize in blue, like, or like people start throwing things. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to cause any. So yeah, but I do a lot of research up north at University of Michigan's biological station, which is a really cool place. One of the experiments that I've worked a lot in is this crazy thing that we did at Hubbard Brook, where we created an ice storm. So we drove fire trucks out into the forest on the coldest day of the year and pointed the fire hoses up into the air. And they shot the water up into the air and let it come down onto the trees and created an ice storm. And it was crazy, but it actually worked. So this is one of the ice storm plots that got 3/4 of an inch of ice applied to the forest, and you can see all these trees bent over and damaged, a bunch of trees down. So this ice storm had really strong impacts on the canopy structure, and we've been following it over time. So the ice storm, this is pre-disturbance. Ice storm happened in the winter of 2015 and 2016. And then you see a big jump in canopy openness, right, related to this damage. And especially you see variation among the treatments. So the one that's highest here is that 3/4 of an inch of ice. And you see variation in the canopy structural outcome as a function of how heavy the icing was. And we've been following this over time, also trying to understand how the forest is responding from a compositional standpoint and production standpoint. And to some extent, the canopy is coming back to its original condition, but not entirely, right? So there's lower vegetation area index. The height of the canopy is much shorter. So that's not that all of the trees died, it's that there's a lot more vegetation down low when you open up the upper canopy, and that's going to have implications for the future of this forest. And so it'd be really interesting to follow this over the next, couple decades. But even within the first 10 years of this study, we're getting some really interesting results. Our next thing that we're trying to get funded, if NSF still exists, they might fund this, is an ash protection experiment. You lost all your ash a long time ago. At Hubbard Brook, they're just emerald ash borer just got there in the last couple of years. And so a local company went out and was injecting a bunch of ash trees within the dicloprid to protect them from the ash borers. And we're using this as kind of a backwards disturbance experiment where we're protecting some groves of ash from the disturbance and see what will happen from a functional and structural standpoint if you don't allow that disturbance to play out. And this is in a system with a high beech dominance, so you get these massive pulses of beech when the ashes die. So we're trying to see what the structural outcomes from not allowing that to happen will be. Here, closer to home here at the University of Michigan's biological station, we have several different experiments that we've been working on. One is called the Forest Accelerated Succession Experiment, or FACET. I didn't come up with that name, but I like how they use the T from the end of the word. It's very creative. This is a study that was initiated by Chris Goff and some other people at UMBS, where across a 40-hectare area that has an eddy flux tower next to the primary Ameriflux tower at UMBS, where they girdled all of the early successional trees, so all the aspen and birch that were 100 years old. So they're getting close to their maximum age, but they're basically speeded up succession and killed all those aspen and birch. And overlaying this on that canopy structural types thing that I showed before, you can see all these very clear patterns in change. It's totally like they just went all the different directions that you could possibly imagine. There's no pattern. There was no consistent change in canopy structure associated with this disturbance, which is relatively similar, right? It's the same disturbance across the 40-hectare area. But there's a lot of variation across this 40-hectare landscape in what the other species were, how much aspen and birch there was in different places. There's different landscape ecosystem types. So we think that because we weren't controlling disturbance severity or directionality or compositional effect, that's why we don't get these consistent results. So because we didn't control severity, directionality, and composition, we decided that we should. So we did a second experiment called, this time we used the first two letters in forest. I actually did come up with this one. Forest resilience threshold experiment, which one of the outcomes of that previous experiment is we saw that the system totally crashed above 60% disturbance, 60% base area removal. So we wanted to see if that happened, if that was consistent across different forest types, different landscape ecosystem types. But we also wanted to explicitly control severity and explicitly control directionality of the treatment. So top down versus bottom up. So three different levels of basal area removal, 45, 65, 85, with the idea that 65 would be right on that cusp where the system is probably not going to change that much, and 85 is we're going to crash the system entirely. In terms of canopy structure, what we found is also not a consistent relationship, and a kind of a weird pattern where the 45% treatment actually strongly overlaps and maybe is less complex than the control. The 65% treatment really increased complexity, and the 85% treatment kind of decreased or retained the same complexity. And there wasn't a strong influence of bottom up versus top down, but there was, a little bit of a overlap, but a little bit of a difference. So this higher severity disturbance seems to have simplified the system, which is not entirely surprising, right? That, you take out most of the trees, there's not much vegetation left to create complexity. And we're limited here. We, have 20-something plots arrayed across 4 different ecosystem types. We thought, okay, is this a real pattern? And you can see everything's overlapping the zero line because we don't have that much power. It's really hard to study these things in the field and create these disturbance experiments. And we thought about going to the administration at UMBS and saying, hey, can we create 100 more of these and see if the pattern is still there? And eventually they're going to get mad at us for killing all the trees. So we said, okay, well, we have computers and we have LiDAR. Let's see what happens if we do this in a model. So we take our 3D canopy models and create these individual tree models, individual segmented tree models, and implemented random disturbances. So Brandon Alvashir did this, implemented 10,000 random disturbances in a bunch of different stands that we had forest models for, to evaluate what the structural outcomes of those disturbances would be. So we just made some code that would randomly pull trees out of the model and use that as a disturbance. And what he found was, kind of interestingly, so this is the amount of the amount of basal area that was removed in each scenario, and this was the change in complexity. So increased and then decreased. To some extent, this kind of matches that pattern we saw in the field in the 4K experiment, where we see lower complexity at high levels of disturbance. But we saw increased complexity across most, there's a huge span here because, there's a lot of variation among these different outcomes, but mostly increased complexity until you reach that really high level of severity. but also it wasn't that strong of a predictor. You'd think severity would be a strong predictor of complexity outcomes, but that's not what we found. What we found instead was that the directionality of the disturbance was the primary driver of the structural outcomes. So whether it was a top-down versus bottom-up treatment was really what mattered. So the proportion of basal area removed that was suppressed, or the proportion basal area that was codominant, were the strongest predictors from a random forest model of like predicting the outcomes. That doesn't necessarily match our findings from the field experiment where the top-down versus bottom-up kind of overlapped each other. But those are just a few plots in one forest type. These were plots at the University of Connecticut's forest, which is a different forest type, a different successional stage, lots of things that are different. So it's not entirely surprising that we would have a different outcome. It's something that we need to study across a lot more forests to try and understand how this might play out. We're also interested in linking these structural outcomes to how a forest responds to a disturbance. So how do they affect functioning and resilience to the disturbance, and how different disturbance characteristics might influence that. So we use this, this is a multi-dimensional stability framework that Kayla Mathis, who worked with us, designed. It's based on some work from community ecology, but we're applying it to ecosystems here. Basically illustrating the resistance of a system to a disturbance is how much it changes initially, resilience is how it changes over time, and the recovery is where it ends up. And we use these metrics of stability to assess the outcomes of disturbance for something like net primary productivity. And so we use these disturbance experiments to study this too, like how much does the complexity of the canopy as an outcome of the disturbance affect the system's response. So this is that Forte experiment again, and we found a pretty strong, this is resistance of net primary productivity, pretty strong relationship where the complexity of the forest allowed the system to be more resistant to that disturbance. But again, this is like one hard thing here is that forests take a long time to grow and respond to things. So we're still in that resistance phase, the really initial starting phase of the response. So whether the complexity affects resilience or recovery of the system, we're not sure yet. We're also interested in isolating that complexity effect from the disturbance response. So again, this complexity manipulation experiment that we have at UConn, really this is a disturbance, right? We're going in and cutting a bunch of trees. So we're going to be able to follow this system as it responds to that disturbance, which was the same in every plot. So we designed those complexity treatments and the maintain treatments have the exact, essentially the exact same basal area removal. So the same disturbance severity. So we should be able to understand how those complexity outcome differences affect the resistance and resilience of the system to that disturbance. But again, we just did it, so it's going to take a decade for us to really understand that. And there is, some potential to use modeling to, like ecosystem modeling or stand dynamics modeling, to get around that we have to wait 10 years thing. But I think one problem is that a lot of our models are very, don't really care about complexity in the canopy and don't have a way to even incorporate it into the modeling framework. That's something we're working on. One thing I'm really interested in and kind of where I'm going next is trying to understand disturbance interactions in forests. So if you have a windstorm plus a defoliation, how does that affect the system and how do those interactive effects work? When do you start to see compounding effects of disturbance? We came up with this, the ice storm was pretty ridiculous. We came up with this, the next ridiculous experiment that we came up with was defoliating canopies. So we have a bucket lift and you take a power washer and go up into the canopy with the power washer and blast the trees with the power washer. It's different, obviously, in some ways from a spongy moth outbreak or something, but it does remove canopy leaf area in a very similar manner, right? It's breaking the leaves, but leaving the petioles, and so you reduce the leaf area of individual leaves. So you can see here, this is me up in the bucket lift at the top of the canopy. I'm afraid of heights, so this kind of sucks. But it's kind of fun to do with power washing. You can blast the tree. And so there's the tree after half an hour of work. And you can do this at the scale of a canopy if you're willing to put in the time and effort. And we tried to get NSF to let us do it. We got medium priority a couple times, but not yet. So this is something we're working on, but we also recognize that you can be opportunistic about disturbance. One thing you'll learn if you study forests for a long time is that they're always changing. Nothing ever stays the same for very long, which is often very annoying, but also kind of cool. So we can use these disturbance experiments that we have as the baseline, and then when there's disturbances that come in, use them opportunistically to study the effects of the prior disturbance on the response of the system to the subsequent disturbance. So you guys probably are just about to have beech leaf disease here.
We have it.
You have it. Yeah. If you just got it, in a couple of years, all your beech trees are going to be dead, like they are in Connecticut where I live. So it's the next big disturbance that's coming, and it's going to have a really strong structural effect on our forest because, unlike beech bark disease, it kills the saplings and takes out the canopy from below. Understanding how that's going to interact with things like that ash protection experiment or the ice storm is going to be really interesting, because that ice storm put all the canopy down low and it's all beech, right? So what happens when you have this interacting disturbance will be really exciting. Another thing that's both horrible but also really exciting is the ice storm that just happened up in northern Michigan. So all those disturbance experiments I was telling you about just got totally wiped out by the ice storm. And we're going to have to figure out what to do about that, but it provides us this really interesting opportunity to understand the legacies of those prior disturbances for the response to this subsequent disturbance at a landscape scale. So we're writing a rapid proposal to NSF right now to try and get money to do this work up there. So finally, I mentioned that I'm a silviculturalist too, and I haven't talked about it at all. But one thing I'm really interested in is trying to incorporate all of this, all the stuff that I was talking about, into our understanding of silvicultural practices and how they might affect complexity. And this is both trying to understand what the outcomes of our current practices are for changing canopy complexity and the functioning that comes with it, but also thinking about whether it makes sense to design silvicultural treatments explicitly around affecting canopy structural complexity. And then to relate this to all these silvicultural, I call them trends, I feel like that's kind of mean, but trends or priorities, these programs that are often referencing structural complexity, but not explicitly really trying to influence it. So a big thing in the Northeast is silviculture with birds in mind. It's also a thing in Michigan, I'm sure. We have adaptive silviculture for climate change. We have all these ecological silviculture strategies that all reference complexity, but aren't necessarily trying to quantify it. And so we've done some work on this, and this is the other thing that my student Brandon Alvashir did, was he had one project where he studied the outcomes of the multi-decadal application of single tree selection in the long-term cutting cycles and stocking levels trials at the Duke's Experimental Forest and the Argonne Experimental Forest and the Ford Forest up in northern Michigan and northern Wisconsin. So these are places where single tree selection was basically designed, right? And it's been applied in an experimental fashion to these different stands since like the 1950s. And we were interested in do these different stocking levels in single tree selection have different structural outcomes currently, right? So if you apply these different levels of stocking, do they come out with different impacts on the canopy? And the answer is no, not really. They're different from a control where you basically were just leaving the forest, but the more intense, the different diameter limits, the different stocking levels did not influence much the outcomes in terms of single tree selection. But there's two different systems here. There's a old growth forest, like Duke's experimental forest was never cut over, and then they started applying single tree selection in it. Argonne forest was a second growth stand. The Argonne is very different from the Dukes in the single tree selection managed forests and in the old growth controls. But what we found is the treated second growth stands were much lower complexity than the old growth treated stands. So basically what happened was in those second growth stands, we're basically limiting their ability to become complex by applying single tree selection. Whereas if you allowed those second growth stands to just grow since the 1950s, they converged with the old growth forests, which is not something a manager who's trying to fight back against preservationism is going to want to hear. But obviously there's other benefits to managing forests, right? And but this is one thing that we found is that allowing those forests just to grow, they did converge toward the old growth forest condition in terms of canopy complexity at least. Brandon also, in that same model that we used, was interested in looking at some silvicultural treatments. So he actually had an expert, I don't know if I should call myself that, but I went in and designed silvicultural treatments using his 3D models and applied them, based on how I would apply those silvicultural treatments in these oak hickory forests, and a whole range of different things. Some retention type treatments and regeneration treatments, thinning treatments. These are the blue ones here are diameter limit, like high grading, and then single tree selection. And basically we found that they all have different complexity outcomes. Like if you apply these different silvicultural treatments, you end up with different complexity outcomes, which is interesting. One thing that's interesting here is in terms of creating complexity in the canopy, things like crop tree release are creating a really complex canopy if you apply them, at least in terms of the direct structural outcome after the treatment, right? Versus these blue is the high grading, like diameter limit cutting, where you basically really top down simplifying the forest. Okay, in terms of kind of takeaways and where we're going with this. So we found that structural complexity varies among forest types and across different ecosystem types. So we're trying to understand better how species and functional traits assemble to create those different canopies and how universal those relationships are, but also how long-term disturbance histories might affect this. So we're working in some old growth forests with Neil Peterson's lab where they have these long disturbance histories. To try and understand how these canopies develop over time. Again, moderate disturbance across a range of severities affects complexity and productivity, that linkage. We're trying to understand that kind of interaction more in the future. And then one thing I'm really interested in then is trying to design silvicultural strategies around creating complex outcomes, promoting complexity, using these tools, these LiDAR-derived 3D models to create treatments that silviculturalists might be able to apply in the field, and then deciding whether that really makes sense as a strategy, right? Whether that's really what we want to be trying to do, but having the ability to do that, I think, is really interesting. Okay, that's all I've got. There's too many acknowledgements, but a lot of funding and a million people that were involved in this stuff. From a lot of different places, and then I'll take some questions. But I just wanted to have I just wanted to show, this is Dave, in 2014, maybe, something 10 years ago. I made him plant oak seedlings and made him walk around the woods. I don't know what this ridiculous experiment was, but we actually published a paper together when he was still my technician at Morton. Was that your first publication?
No,
Might
you
not.
got me on the other one first, the crowd stress and urban environment.
So thanks, Dave, for inviting me.
Yeah.
And thanks everyone for coming.
Got some time for questions?
Yes,
Sorry.
I was gonna ask you about the induced ice storm thing. You took a fire truck into the woods, so I'm trying to picture how that worked. Did the fire truck go down Forest Service Road and you just kind of sprayed off the sides of the road? The hose to induce the ice storm, and so was there then a road gap in the middle of everything you sprayed?
So the fire truck was on the road as a pump, and then the hose went down and they had a ATV that drove the hose out and then directed it from out in the forest. So it's far enough away from the woods road that it's not really road affected.
Okay.
But again, the plots are the size of this room. So the experiment didn't really work for the ecosystem ecologists. It worked for me because the structure of the forest changed a lot. But they expected, based on the 1998 ice storm, the public book, they expected a big pulse of nitrogen out of the system. Didn't see anything because the plots were so small, the trees roots just grew into the most likely. But it would be really interesting at UMBS to see the effects of this ice storm, where we have this long-term monitoring and we have these prior experiments. There's a lot of cool questions.
I guess kind of related to that, do you think there's anything you can take away from a small patch of forest the size of this room? Like if it's got really high complexity in this area because there's so many different trees growing, can you extrapolate that to a bigger scale with any sort of accuracy, a manipulation like that, or is it just totally case by case?
Yeah, well, one thing that we've found is something like a moderate severity windstorm will create patches of very low complexity because you get a blowdown. So we had a study at the Duke's Research Natural Area. In the old growth forest, you get these big patches where there's no trees, which is super not complex, right? But at a landscape scale, because there's variation in the disturbance severity, you get a much higher landscape level complexity than in a system where you manage like with single tree selection, where you're just pulling out individual trees. And so single tree selection reduces complexity in terms of species composition. That's something that's been shown a lot, but also seems to have the same effect on canopy relative to things that get natural disturbance for the attachments.
Right.
And so we can use that in management, right? And that's the whole idea of multi-cohort management that my advisor, PhD advisor, Craig Lorimer, always would talk about is let's create patchy conditions across a large stand or small landscape scale to mimic natural disturbance. Cool.
Do you think if you were to stratify the rugosity store by overstory and like mid-story, that you might find that in stands that have a mid-story, that some measure of rugosity of that mid-story would inform the resiliency of that stand to a top-down disturbance?
Yeah, and a lot of our results at UMBS were related to subcanopy response, and where you have that subcanopy that's sitting there waiting for the disturbance. You have a very, like in that facet experiment, there's basically no effect of that disturbance, which removed some places 60% or more of the base area. Anyway, you'd have places where you remove 50% of the base area, and there's basically no productivity response. The system was entirely resistant, even in the next year, to that disturbance, and then quickly became much more productive. And that's because there's that robust subcanopy. If we did the same thing in Connecticut, we would not, and I'm expecting this with that complexity experiment in Connecticut, we won't find the same thing because there's no subcanopy because the area of everything. Yeah. So that mid-story is really, really important. And some of our metrics kind of are indicators of how robust that subcamp is. Or you can just look at a size cost distribution and use that to understand it. But yeah, where we've lost that mid-story, which is basically all of the forests in the eastern US, these systems are going to not be as resistant to disturbance. So that's something we're also trying to understand. Anything else?
Okay, I think it's a good time to.
Lunch?
Lunch, so.